My name is Father Cajetan Cuddy. I'm the general editor of the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology, ECT. I'm here with my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Matthew K. Meinert, who's the managing editor of the ECT, and we're going to discuss the theological lexicon found on ect.org, whereby we have entries on important theological doctrines. And today we're going to discuss the doctrine of divinization or theosis. And this is what the ECT says. The process by which human persons are transformed in their being and consequently in their actions by grace. Such supernatural transformation belongs to the entitative order and is not a juridical fiction, merely declaring that a given believer is holy in the eyes of God. Although referred to by various terms in Greek or Latin, the notion of theosis is as ancient as the gospel message itself. The fathers of the church regularly connected the notion, and at times the term itself, to Christology. Christ's human nature through the hypostatic union is divinized. It enjoys the plenitude of created grace, a grace inherently linked to the hypostatic union. The dogmatic truth of Christ's own divinity is so connected to the reality of theosis that to deny one of these realities would imply the denial of the other. The reality of theosis is closely connected to a variety of scriptural themes: filial adoption and new birth through baptism, the relation of the old Adam to the new Adam, Christ's headship, Christ as the life of the believer. A classic maxim found in the Fathers and the Church's various liturgical traditions expresses this reality in terms of a divine exchange. God became man so that man might become God. So that's a loaded definition, but I think it needed to be loaded in order to give even a cursory overview of such an important doctrine, huh?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, this is like to an Easterner, like one's favorite place to be. It's classically associated with the East, although you know as a Thomist that the theology of divinization or theosis, they're effectively words that are doing the same thing in different languages, is just incredibly important for understanding really what would be the true conception of a Christian life, as truly partaking in the Trinity's own life, by which we are configured to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but through Christ's activity, through his sacred humanity, acting in the church, and acting above all through the sacraments as his instruments. But it's so quintessentially the thing that links classical Christianity all the way through to today. Really makes us quite different from Protestant theories of salvation. Far be it from us to get into polemics here, but that's what's going on. For instance, among the many nuggets that are in this long lexicon entry, is this bit about it's not just a juridical fiction, right? When we are saved through baptism, it's not just that God kind of gets the paper and sort of scratches things out, but rather God, by giving us sanctifying grace and the character of baptism, now begins the process of then continued deepening of our configuration to Christ and to the Trinity. And so like the whole of the Christian life runs downstream of this, the whole of the moral life runs downstream of this notion, the whole of spiritual life does. So it's at the nub of where grace meets us, so to speak.
And the fact that it actually meets us and that it's the same us before grace and after grace is so important. That's why it's called divinization. It's not a divine replacementism or a theological
Mm-hmm.
demolition of human nature. What I like to tell my students often is that without a robust conception of human nature, there is no salvation, because there's not something about me that is the same before grace and after grace, then I'm not saved. At best, I'm a completely new being. But if I'm a completely new being, recreated literally, essentially in grace, then that's not salvation. And then the lexicon entry, it's very careful to point out how the Christological elements too, the fact that you can have a human nature and a divine nature come together in such an integrated way while maintaining their distinction, yet their real hypostatic union. Without these categories, it's impossible. And by these categories, I mean the categories, the doctrines of theosis and divinization, how God infuses us, transforms us by his grace. It's literally impossible to talk about salvation or Christology or the incarnation or the sacraments at all.
Yeah, that's great. And that's such a Dominican way to make sure. Look how beautifully the harmony of nature and grace is here. Like, that's good, though, because, Byzantine can just bleach it out, right? The Byzantine will want to bleach out things with the uncreated light, even though, I mean, we don't. We believe, we emphasize, transfiguration cannot be spoken of, actually, unless you have that which is transfigured, right? Because otherwise it's just light. The Christology thing is very interesting historically, right? That there's this development in the theological mind and dogmatic mind of the church that this term gets applied, theosis, to this fact about Christ's human nature, and then there's this realization of the connection, though, to our destiny as well. This is for someone who's walking in, when you do moral theology and you start talking about the various virtues, the theological virtues, the Christian moral virtues, or for us Thomists, the infused moral virtues, etc. What your kind of your context that you're within is to understand the activity, at least, of living according to these virtues is the process of theosis. Maybe you could say something, Father, because I'm actually interested in this, because I think about this a lot as a professor at the Byzantine context. So theosis is sort of the place we stop at the level of principles whenever we instruct in moral theology. A Thomist is going to talk about beatitude. How do you think about the relationship between beatitude and theosis? How do you articulate those two?
It's an interesting question, and I'm going to answer maybe a little technically, not for you, of course, but for our dear viewers. But that's only so that we can have a place to start with and then unpack. My first thought about that is the entitative subjectivity of divine grace in the soul as a habitus, a habit, residing in the capacities of human intellection and volition, and even in the essence of the soul, grace. First act is always ordered to second act. And so the final causal purpose and orientation of grace, theosifying, divinizing the human person, requires a highest type of second act operation, namely seeing God face to face and enjoying him forever. So that's what I think of when I think of basically divinization in me here and now as a recipient of baptism and of God's divine sanctifying grace, without that final causal entelechy and directedness towards beatific hyperactivity. I don't think it's intelligible. So that's my initial thought, but I welcome your
Oh yeah,
follow-up.
no, yeah. I think that's in line sort of with how I would think of it. It's so funny though. I'm so used to dancing around the technicalities of our language because one does not speak this way as a Byzantine because one gets in trouble. But to put it a different way, theosis, the word, or divinization, both of them actually have it's a progressive element that's in it. In the Greek, the osis, for instance, is doing this idea of it's basically the it's a subjective process. It's the growth in the habitus, or habits. People tend to misunderstand the word habit, but of the various virtues and the activities that go with those virtues, right? It's focusing on that process of growth, deepening, etc. Like you could say the Christian life, the moral life being lived out, which, however, it's not quite a motion, right? Strictly speaking, right? But I'm kind of just using at the level of maybe a metaphor. You can't understand emotion without understanding ultimately the end of that motion, right? Now, again, we got to be careful there because these are operations which actually technically, as spiritual, aren't motions. You see, this is, again, you start getting theologians together, especially people who are Thomists, and they start making distinctions, and it's miserable. But the point you're making is, you really can't understand this both subjective alteration of us as well as the process that flows from that unless you understand then the end of that both change and that process of deepening. Which is then, why, for instance, the Thomist tradition sticks beatitude at the head of moral things. Usually what this does in our context is it enables a lot of connections dogmatically for us because of the history in the Byzantine tradition. So whenever you kind of dip down into this, you kind of end up going, instead of in that analytic way that maybe one would do, parsing the secunda pars of the Summa, instead you start making these connections to some of the Christology and ecclesiology connections, as well as sacramental theology. Not that Thomists don't do that. It's just a kind of different. It's a different it's a different way of walking. I don't know how else to put it.
Well,
So,
that's very interesting. And it's what you say, everything is very important, even if the strut is slightly different. We still have a Christian gait. And because of that, just as we conclude, I think you and I both agree that we're excited to have Professor Daniel Keating from Sacred Heart
mhm.
Seminary as the one who will author a full length article on divinization and theosis for the ECT. So our viewers can be, if you did not find this conversation between Dr. Minard and I to be the most pellucidly illuminating thing you've ever heard, um, you could perhaps read Professor Keating's forthcoming essay and then come back to this conversation and realize how much fun we're having and how interesting we've been. But just back to what we've said, that this is where Dr. Minor and I both are eager to populate the ECT with things that are connected to key doctrines of the Christian life, like theosis and divinization. So wonderful. Well, Dr. Minor, any closing thoughts?
Well, I just would, yeah, I very much recommend that when the article comes out to read it, and to consider, I mean, to consider this dogmatic aspect of the teachings of the church, because very often Christians don't realize actually the fact that they so to speak, they should be walking not just with with the Christian gate, which is a divine Trinity configured gate in all of their actions. We need to understand what our vocation is, and I think that meditating on the mystery of theosis is often very practically accessible, actually, in people's prayer life. To think about your vocation, what you're called to, is nothing short of really living a participation in the divine life. So it's something that is. It could be so fun that if we wanted to be nerds, we could do 25 different videos on this definition, just kind of going through each as you're going along, taking one thread of it, another piece of it, another piece of it, etc. So.
Excellent. Well, good. No, I couldn't agree more. It's part of the Christian life. It's what Jesus came to effect within us. Uh, Dr. Minor, on an earlier episode, has said that I don't like the word perspective. He rightly takes objection to my use of effect as a verb. And so, in the spirit of enjoyment, we will bring
Jabbing.
we will we will bring this video to a close for now, but we will be back in the near future with more videos.